I've started recording. Here we go. Okay. My account is updated, so I'm in class with all of you lovely patient people. And my document is uploaded. And now that I started the recording, I'll go back so we can see the opening slide. This is we're talking about Korech. I'm Sarah Rudolph, Sarah Davis Rudolph. It's funny that my name gets displayed different places in different ways in different places. People who know me on Facebook, I can put the Davis in because that's my Facebook name. I don't really use it, but I'm happy to keep it in there, but for my roots, so that's fine. But I do go by Sarah Rudolph, whichever one. It is April 9th, 2024. I used to try to make a point of saying that at the beginning of these classes. We are talking about Korech, part of this amazing program that WebYeshiva has been doing for the past few years to learn the different elements of the Seder, and in the weeks leading up to Pesach, which I think is so cool. And I've been able to learn that Hillel with you in the past, and Baruch, I think we did. And this year I got Korech. So there goes the notifications. I really, have to. I don't know how to make it go away, even when I think I turn it off, but we'll ignore it. So we're going to start off by orienting ourselves and see what we can get through in our time together today to learn together about Korech. So we're going to orient ourselves. My Haggadah is Ashkenazi. That's my familiarity. So those of you who might have Sephardi heritage, feel free. Oh, I see another name I recognize. I don't know if you just joined or I didn't notice, but welcome everybody. So for those of you, again, who might have Sephardi background, I welcome your, additions and comments, preferably in the chat box, because I am going to try to talk as quickly as possible and get through as much as we can without being too fast or too unclear. So also stop me if those become problems. So in the Ashkenazi, at least Haggadah for Pesach. So let's say I started my excerpt here with motzi matzah, because obviously if we're talking about Korech, we're talking about matzah and maror as well. So you see my little color coding, so you can follow here. Obviously, with many Haggadahs, we have instructions also. So motzi matzah and maror are both very quick. They take up a little bit of space because you have the instructions, right? Use this matzah and that matzah. You recline, you don't recline, you dip, and maror and the charoset, you shake off the charoset, you do a little dance, right? Whatever it is that your family does or that your Haggadah tells you to do. With lots of different minhagim in this regard. So we eat the matzah, we eat the maror, and then we eat the korech. And again, as far as those details like dipping and shaking the charoset and the measurements of exactly how much to have of each thing at each stage, that I will leave for your preferred halachic authorities and or your family customs. Apologize, I do have a cough that's going to interfere a little bit, but hopefully not. We might talk a little bit about some of those details like charoset and reclining and things like that, but we might not, so we'll see. I'll tell you the first thing that came to mind when I started saying, oh, Korech, I'd like to take that one this year and delve into Korech a little bit, learn a little more and share a little more. And the first thing that comes to mind is actually, I believe it was my sister who commented one year as we're saying our, proclamation, right? We have the matzah, we have the maror, then we put them together and we say, we're doing this just like Hillel did, right? Zecher l'mikdash Hillel, this is the memory of the temple like Hillel, right? And I have translations on here pretty much from Sparia, which, some translations are good, some are not good, some are just different from how another person might translate. So I may or may not stick with the translations exactly. I may or may not call out the translations at various points. But I will try to translate. As you say, it's a memory of the mikdash, of the temple, according to Hillel, in accordance with Hillel. Thus, like this did Hillel, right? Hillel did this at the time the Beis Hamikdash was standing. He would wrap, right? I'm going to use the word wrap because that seems to be the most literal translation of Korech. But obviously those of us who, again, have strong Ashkenazi roots, our matzah is very hard. So how does it work to wrap? Interestingly, I had not just known this before. Apparently there are those who say that the that the maror should be wrapped around the matzah, which makes a lot of sense if you're having hard matzah and trying to wrap it. Others eat nice soft matzah. Some people eat soft matzah at the Seder specifically in order to wrap it around their maror. So again, different practices. But we wrap it or we just put it together somehow if we're not literally wrapping. matzah and maror and eat them together. Notice it says matzah and maror. There are different opinions whether Hillel's sandwich, as we like to call it, or his wrap, or his shawarma, as my husband likes to say, whether it was actually a shawarma, whether it included the korban pesach, or he had the korban pesach by itself and had the matzah and the maror as a combination together, or whether he combined all three. But in this version, it says just matzah and maror, and you would eat them together. Why did he do this? To fulfill that which is said, al matzos u'merorim yochluhu. You should eat it being the korban pesach, on matzah and maror, right? So the question is, what does that mean? What's that pasuk describing? It seems that actually there, so we'll see in the Gemara, there's an opposing position, right? Hillel was not unanimous, right? The rabbis were not unanimously in favor of Hillel. Actually, the reason that we do what we do today stems from a compromise, trying to fulfill Hillel's perspective and the perspective of the majority of the rabbis at the time who were actually opposed to his idea, to his view. And they read that pasuk as sort of, emphasizing the singular. And it's the way I saw one commentary explain it. That they said, oh, you eat like the thing, each thing separately, basically. So there's always subjectivity in how we look at and how we read into a text. Very careful, precise reading is sometimes objective and sometimes very subjective, right? Which way it can go. So Hillel seems to have focused on the word al, right? Eat the Pesach on, either literally on, meaning the matzah and maror, meaning you would have all three together, or with matzah and maror, but put the matzah and maror together, right? So again, different ways to understand exactly what it was that Hillel did, whether he had 2 ingredients in his sandwich or 3. And that's reflected in different versions of the text in the Haggadah. That some Haggadahs will have the word Pesach in there, along with matzah and maror. Some will have Pesach in parentheses. I think I've seen that one. So all sorts of questions that are raised. And the question that, as I mentioned, I always think of my sister. So I'm pretty sure it was my sister who once observed, and if Hillel, so we're eating this because Hillel did. If Hillel jumped off the Empire State Building, would we do that too? Right? And if that sounds bizarre, right? So on one hand, yes, it's a little disrespectful. We're talking about Hillel, but putting that part aside, right? Hopefully everyone's familiar with the line that she was, referencing, where the kid wants to do something because all their friends are doing it, and his parents' natural response is, oh, and just because everyone's doing it, right? If they did something crazy, if they jumped off the Empire State Building, would you do that too? Right? So how crazy is this? Well, there are those opinions in the Gemara, again, who disagreed with Hillel. But so obviously, it's a little bit of an extreme formulation that my sister would use, and she was joking, but it kind of sticks with me, right? We do this because we want to be like Hillel. Well, of course, that's great. We should be like Hillel, right? He was a great guy. But do we do everything that Hillel did, right? It seems like a funny way to say it, right? And if it's a funny way to say it, well, is it a funny way to do it, right? Is there something strange about what is it that we're really doing here? And I think those of us who have grown up doing this, sometimes we're so used to something we don't even notice, right? But what is it that we're really doing here? What are we doing? Why are we doing it? And we might also ask them, why are we saying this thing, right? What's the significance of sitting down and declaring, I am doing this like Hillel did, right? Hillel, I don't know, I don't want to take it too far with the analogies to teenagers trying to be like each other, but you get the point, right? So what is it that we're doing and what is it that we're saying? You're going to see I have the handout kind of loosely divided along those lines, right? We have a little heading here, pointer, what we do, and then you'll see below what we say. And we'll talk about, hopefully, both of those elements. The first thing to look at in terms of what we do is, of course, the pasuk, right? We always want to start with the pasuk. And I will note that formatting seems to have gotten messed up here just a little bit. Hopefully it'll all be readable. And hopefully my throat won't give out before we're done reading. So pasuk source, note that the pasuk that is cited in the Haggadah is from Bamidbar, right? What does Bamidbar have to do with Pesach, right? Isn't the Pesach story in the book of Shmos? So this is Pesach Sheni, right? It happened in the desert the second year that they were in the desert, that people, that there were some people who were not able to bring the Korban Pesach for whatever reason exactly. It happened. They were impure and they weren't able to bring the Korban Pesach on Pesach. And they came to Moshe and said, Nebuch, like we're going to miss out this great mitzvah, right? So he says, hold on, I'll check with God. Isn't that great? We all wish we could hold on, let me check with God, right? So he does, and God spoke to him, and he says in the part that's on the handout here, So speak to them and say when this happens, right? If you're either defiled, right? If you're tamei meis on Pesach, or you're too far away from the Beis Hamikdash, you're not able to bring the Korban Pesach on Pesach. Then b'chodesh hasheni ב14 yom ben harbayim ya'asu oto al matzos u'merurim yochluhu. Then in the second month, on right, Pesach is in the first month coming up, right? Happy Rosh Chodesh, everybody. In the second month, on the 14th day of the month, right, in the evening, that's when they'll do it, right? You get a makeup, right, for a Korban Pesach, in these certain parameters, right, with these certain situations, and you'll eat it, right, on matzah and maror, right, on with however we understand it exactly, right. So that's where the Pesach comes from, that the Haggadah is quoting. Now, you might have a question about that. If you do, I encourage you to mention it in the chat, but we're gonna hold off and hopefully get back to the question you should be asking. There's a teaser right there. Let's just see. 1 second. All right. Second thing. The next step, we want to understand what we do and why we do it. And otherwise, oh my goodness, look at that fullness. What it actually says there. I can't read that any more than you, but I have a cheat sheet. My printout of this handout. What it actually says there, under the heading Gemara of Psachim, is that you should note, please, the presence of two different Hillels in this passage. And I wish someone had said that to me before the first time I read this passage, because I was thoroughly confused. Because what do we start with? Ravina said, right? I'm going to try to go a little bit quickly, depending how deeply we get into like really fine points of understanding what's going on in the Gemara. We could take a whole hour or more just on that, but we're going to try to glide through it with a surface understanding and, enough, but not too much. So, again, stop me if I'm egregiously not explaining myself, or the Gemara. So Ravina says, in that Rav Marashaya, the son of Rabbi Nassan, said to me that thus said Hillel in the name of Gemara, right? And Gemara here is translated as tradition. I saw some discussion in one article about this Gemara, sort of pointing to different places where the term Gemara is used in similar ways to mean tradition, and it seems like a valid translation, so we'll go with that, right? Hillel stated, based on something that he had learned, Lo nichroch inish matzah mar b'hadei hadadei v'nechol. Hillel said, and again citing tradition, right? He learned this. A person should not wrap matzah and maror together and eat them. So you first read this, and but you know the Haggadah, right? For 1 second, Hillel said, "Don't wrap matzah and maror together." And eat them. I'm pretty sure he does that, right? So clearly, it has to be a different Hillel, living even in a different time period, as we'll see. How do we see that? Because he goes on, right? Don't wrap them together and eat them. And the Gemara explains, "Mishum desfirlan mitzvah bisman hazeh der." I'm sorry, matzah bisman hazeh. I totally need new glasses prescription. Deraisa imar derabanan. Right? Because we hold that matzah in these days is deraita, and maror is derabanan, right? Matzah in this time period, right, in our times, is a Torah obligation, but maror is a rabbinic obligation, right? It does not have a Torah level status. So tell me, how do I know that this Hillel is not the one that we're talking about in the Haggadah? Because first of all, that one's going to be quoted later on, right? This Gemara is where the Haggadah gets it, but also because very simply, bisman hazeh, right? He's clearly speaking in a time when the Beis Hamikdash is not standing, and Hillel lived at a time with the Beis Hamikdash, right? He lived when he could very well have been wrapping his Pesach and maror and matzah all together, whereas this Hillel is clearly talking about a time where there is no Korban Pesach, right? It's in these days, right? They're right. Why is matzah bisman hazeh in these days deraita and maror only derabanan? Well, matzah is easily deraita because there's a straight pasuk that says to eat it, right? Maror is understood, and this comes up later in the Gemara. If anyone wants to look at it later, it's the Chaf Amud Aleph at 120a, where Rava states that matzah today, meaning after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, is deraita and maror is derabanan. Why? So because it says the mitzvah of maror is understood to be dependent and very intrinsically tied up with the mitzvah of the Korban Pesach. So if there's no Korban Pesach, there's no Torah obligation of maror. Rama might say there's no Torah obligation of maror at all because it's completely dependent on the Korban Pesach, but that's its own issue. So we understand it to be d'Rabbanan. Now that there's no Korban Pesach, we still eat maror, but it's a rabbinic level institution rather than a Torah level obligation. Matzah, however, we have a separate pasuk that has nothing to do with the Korban Pesach that tells us to eat matzah, right? So matzah is always and forever a Torah obligation on the first night of Pesach, right? The rest of Pesach, you can eat chametz, but you don't have to eat matzah. What will you do about lechem mishnah? That's your own question. If you don't want to eat matzah, but you don't have, there's no active obligation the rest of Pesach to eat matzah. But on Seder night or nights, if you live where I live, right, there certainly is a Torah level obligation to eat matzah, but the maror obligation in the absence of the Beis Hamikdash and a Korban Pesach is only d'Rabbanan. So why does that matter, right? Why does that mean that this Hillel number one, or should I call him number two because he was later, this Hillel number two, why does that mean that we shouldn't eat matzah and maror together? It says because we have a concern, and this is where we could get into lots of more in-depth analysis and explanation, but I'm going to try not to, that he says the maror that is d'Rabbanan will come and nullify the matzah, which is d'oraisa. So let's call this an issue of taste, right? And that's what Rashbam puts in the word taste. I have Rashbam here, but it's on the next page. Just a line, he says the taste of the maror, of the rabbinic maror, will cancel out somehow, will interfere with the taste of the matzah, which is a Torah level obligation. So does the fact that there are different obligations affect, how much the two tastes are going to interfere with each other? Probably not. But somehow we want the matzah to be unadulterated, right? Would be one way to understand this. We want the taste of matzah to be unadulterated, and this because it's on its Torah level obligation, and the maror, which is a lower level obligation, might interfere with that. So we don't want that to happen, right? And it goes on and says, this isn't necessarily part of the larger question of whether one mitzvah is considered to cancel out another, right? Because in that case, right, we're talking about whether one Torah obligation might cancel out another Torah obligation, or a rabbinic obligation might interfere with another rabbinic obligation. But here we're talking about a d'oraita and a d'Rabbanan, and everybody will agree in that case that you have to be concerned that the rabbinic one, the maror, is going to interfere with the Torah one, the matzah, right? So that's why this Hillel, number two, I'm going to call him, is saying not to have them together, because you need to be able to have the taste of the matzah, in its fullest obligatory enjoyment experience, let's say. You don't have to enjoy it, really. You have to experience it. So then it goes on, and the Gemara says, in fact, so there are different opinions, right? And it kind of alluded to the fact that there are different opinions, because this statement to not eat the matzah and maror together in our day applies regardless of what you generally hold as far as one mitzvah canceling another, right? So it goes on. Well, who is it who says, generally speaking, that mitzvahs do not cancel each other, right? Which Tana, which view is that, right? The Gemara does this often, right? Where we have two opinions in the Mishnah, let's say, or two opinions in the Braita, and the Gemara will say, who is it, right? It says this, right? But who, right? We have this anonymous opinion. Who is it? Can we line it up with things that we know elsewhere that so and so said, so we can give it a name, right? We can give this approach a name. It says, it's Hillel. Now again, obviously not this Hillel, right? Because he says they're interfering with each other, and this Hillel apparently says they don't interfere with each other, right? They don't nullify each other. So he says, and how do we know that it's Hillel who says they don't nullify each other? Because Hillel, it's said about Hillel that shaya korchan bebatachat be'ochlan, that he would wrap them together and eat them. And I just want to point out, I highlighted here because this is one of those places where I think not just translation, but here it is actually, every translation is a commentary. Here it's translation and commentary, right? The non-bold is the Steinsaltz sort of explanation. It's not literal word for word translation, but it's in there to help you. But it can still also throw you off because you might not realize, right? In the Hebrew side, all it says is that Hillel would wrap them together and eat them. On the English side, it clarifies for you, what would he wrap? Matzah and maror together, right? Now, again, there are those who understand Hillel's practice to have been wrapping matzah, maror, and korban pesach meat together. So you might get thrown off if you assume that that's, if you're only looking at the English and you think, oh, and you think that's really, the literal translation here, and then you encounter somebody who includes the korban pesach and explaining Hillel's practice, you're going to be a little confused, right? So I just like to point these things out where I can to, clarify and always keep in mind those, potential pitfalls. I love translations. I love commentaries. I always want to keep in mind that that's what they are, right? One perspective. So and again, it indicates that these two foods, right, should be consumed together. So it might be three, right? Right? So we have this Breita that says that it was said about Hillel that he used to wrap them together and eat them together because of this pasuk, right? Because of how he understood this pasuk. I think we're going to skip the rest of this Gemara actually, or skip some of it. There's a dispute about exactly how to understand Hillel's disagreement with the other rabbis, because again, it was Hillel who did this, right? And Rabbi Yochanan says, we'll skip it entirely. Rabbi Yochanan says his colleagues disagreed with him, based on another Breita that says, can it be that you wrap them all up like Hillel did? Right? That seems like a little bit of a knock, right? Like the teacher says, oh, Johnny said this. Well, can it be that Johnny's right? Right? I don't know. But it's a dispute, right? It doesn't turn out to be knocking out Hillel. We accept this as a dispute. And in fact, again, I'm not getting into the details of the dispute and how to understand it exactly and what it's based on. But basically, right, the Gemara ends up saying that, the page, Hashta delo itmar hilchata, lo kehilel velo karabanan. So the Gemara says, you know what? It was never determined, right? We have this malchokas. It's not that we knock out Hillel and say, oh, how do we know that it can't be like Hillel, right? That's one opinion, that it can't be like Hillel, right? But one opinion is that it can't be like Hillel. That's Hillel's opinion, right? Hillel wrapped the things together. The other rabbis didn't think you should do that, based on different ways that they read the pasuk and understand the possible cancellation of different things, of the different tastes, right? So based on their different understandings, they have different views of the halacha of how to eat matzah and maror on Pesach night. So now, what do we do? The Gemara tells us there was never a determination made which of them to paskin by. So it says, we're going to do both. Mevarich al achilat matzah v'achil, right? And you'll notice the color coding here, not coincidentally, matches the color coding on the Haggadah text that I put at the beginning of the handout, right? Because this is exactly what we do. We say the bracha on achilat matzah and we eat matzah. Then we say the bracha on maror and we eat the maror. And then we eat matzah and lettuce together, right? Lettuce being the maror here, and together without a bracha. And we do so zecher l'mikdash, Hillel, right? We do this as a remembrance of the Beis Hamikdash, like Hillel, right? Because in the days of the temple, Hillel would eat matzah and maror together with the korban pesach, right? And here the translation gets a little more iffy, right? It says, the text here says lettuce and matzah, so we kind of have to play with it if we're of the opinion that he wrapped it together with the korban pesach also. But then the commentary at the end over here says we're remembering, we emulate this practice, right? We do this 3-step practice to be both like the rabbis and like Hillel. And we do it like Hillel in the memory because Hillel did it, to eat the matzah and maror in a wrap with the korban pesach, right? It's a practice that stems from the korban pesach. It stems from pasuk about how to eat the korban pesach. So since we don't have one now, but we remember once upon a time there was one, right? There was a korban pesach, so we do the same thing. Okay. Got questions? I hope so. Unfortunately, little time to answer them, but I will raise some. One question I want to raise, this is a question that I always want to raise, right? We have at this point, right? I said this is the doing, right? We're talking about the doing of what we do and why, right? Why do we do it? Why do we do this Korech thing as part of our Seder? Because there's a technical, halachic discussion in the Gemara. How do we read this pasuk, right? How am I going to analyze this text? Should I do it is the text telling me to do this, or is the text telling me to do it like that, right? Oh, we have a disagreement. Okay, I'm going to do both, and I'm going to do both in a way that satisfies both opinions, right? Because if we messed up the order, we can't get into it now, but it's fun to kind of work it through. If we tried a different order, right? If we only did Korech, we would be, or if we did some other order among these 3 steps, we would not be satisfying both opinions. We would be running up against someone's opinion. So commentaries talk about that also. It's always fun to figure out. So if we spent more time on it, right, and hopefully we have a basic level understanding, we see that we have this Korech step at the Seder instead of just a matzah and just a maror step, because we want to satisfy all these opinions about the technical how to read the pasuk, right? That's one way to answer why we do what we do. Another way to answer why we do what we do, right? That's what I always say. There are two types of why. One is the source-based textual analysis, right? The detailed, what does the source say, right? Why do I keep Shabbos? Because the Torah says to keep Shabbos. Alternatively, I could say, why do I keep Shabbos? Well, because I'm testifying that I believe God created the world in 6 days, right? That's a meaningful, right? That's a meaningful why, right? As opposed to a source why. So if I want the meaningful why, it's a little trickier, right? The Gemara doesn't talk about a meaningful why. I spent some time, having some fun on Google and, finding different articles and different suggestions, and there are tons, right? There are tons. There's so much, and I'm not going to call it speculation exactly because it all has basis, right? Let's say, for instance, one common theme that I came up on is that we could look at this symbolism here of combining different things, right? And let's say the matzah, what was matzah symbolize? Easiest answer is freedom, right? The was maror symbolize? Easiest answer, slavery, maybe exile, maybe struggling, right? It's the bitter thing, right? So we have the slavery slash exile slash struggles on one hand, and freedom on the other hand, right? And we take those two together, so then we could play with that in all sorts of ways, right? Based on that sort of foundation, it's pretty clear, it's pretty likely those symbolisms of those two elements in our sandwich. And then, so what do they symbolize, right? What's the meaningful, symbolic why of what we're doing, right? So maybe to combine, I saw a lot of different perspectives sort of saying that we want to take freedom and slavery and combine them, right? Because that's the combination that really makes us truly free, right? When the Gemara says, in charas el chirs ala luchos, there's no freedom except being engraved, right? Play on words there with charas and chirs, except being engraved on the luchos, right? It's the mitzvos, it's being subservient to God that really kind of opens us up to true freedom, to our ability to, let's say, grow into who we are, to pursue our real, true, meaningful goals, right? Again, there are a lot of different ways to work these things out and to think about these things. Others suggest, matzah, maror symbolize the good and the bad, right? We could be very loose with this, right? Good things and bad things, and Hashem is with us for all, right? So it could be in terms of slavery and exile. Hashem, we combine them to say that, really it's all the same because Hashem is always with us, right? There are different ways, we could say it like that. People talk about other people take a completely different approach, right? Not so much what does the maror symbolize and what does the matzah symbolize, but we have this broken piece of matzah, right? That's what we use for the korech. We take this piece of matzah that we already broke. So we have this broken thing, and then we take the maror and the charoset and we put it together and make something with it, right? And we have a beautiful symbolic sandwich to represent Jewish unity, right? We might be broken, we might be divisive sometime, but we're going to bring us together, right? Or maybe there are others who suggest that matzah is spiritual, maror is physical, right? And we bring them together again because it's balance, right? We want to combine the two different elements and, have our korech sandwich combining to represent how we should combine and balance the physical and the spiritual in our lives, right? I'm going to stop there, but there are all sorts of different symbolic ideas, right? We want to, we're going to move through, right? And I wanted to mention some of those ideas. I think they're important. I think it's always important to think about those two different whys, right? What's our source basis for the reasons that we do what we do? And can we get at anything deeper, right? Sometimes we can't, right? Sometimes shatnez is shatnez, kosher is kosher, right? Sometimes we can get at something, dig a little bit deeper and come up with some ideas and finding that meaning. If we want to go on, though, sometimes those two elements certainly can combine with each other, though, right? And sometimes in the details of halacha, we find more meaningfulness also. And hopefully that's the sort of trajectory that we're going to go on now. See, I have some things on here that we're not going to look at together in the end, but they're there. Looking at page 4, source number 4, the Rambam, right? And if we want to, again, sort of trace our halacha development, right? So we start with the pasuk, we saw the Gemara that builds on that pasuk, interprets that pasuk to get at what we do. Then, of course, we always have more questions, right? We want to know, okay, but how do we do this, and what about that, and how do we understand this, right? And get a little more practical, a little more detailed as the Chaim and Sfarim books, literature goes on. So next we're going to look at the Rambam, right? Good place to look for practical halacha. We're going to skip most of the Rambam that's even here, right? And obviously there's more here than out there in Hilchot Chametz and Matzah, there's more about the Seder and about Korech even than I put here, and about Matzah and Maror separately, and about Korech, bringing them together. We're going to look at a couple of excerpt lines. So he starts off, he says, we're at washing that, right? So you wash, you say the bracha, make sure, let's see. Let me pay attention now to what the Rambam is saying. Skip a little bit. Right, so you wash your hands, and you've divided one of them, right? And then, after washing, you wrap matzah and maror together, dip it in charoset, and say the bracha. Watch this. Asher kitshana b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu al achilat matzah u'morim. Say the bracha on eating matzah and maror in one, right? V'ochlan, and eat them. And he goes on. V'im achal matzah b'fnei atzma, u'maror b'fnei atzmo. And if somebody ate matzah by itself and maror by itself, mevarich al zeh b'fnei atzmo, v'al zeh b'fnei atzmo. If you eat them each ingredient separately, then say the bracha on each one separately. Anyone ever hear of this? Do you have an option here? Like, what is this? He skips the individual matzah and maror and jumps to Korech and then says, oh, but you might eat them separately, so then you should say the brachos separately, right? Anyone ever encounter these options that we have choices here? So apparently, right, what do we know about Rambam? When Rambam wrote his book of halacha, who was he writing for? The big, sort of important, I don't know, novel exactly, but unique thing about the Rambam in the wide scheme of halachic literature and practical halachic literature is that unlike a great many halacha books, he includes laws for when the Beis Hamikdash is standing, right? He didn't live when the Beis Hamikdash was standing, but he was aware of the potential, of the hopes, and wanted to keep those halachas alive. So when he's writing this, actually, right, what kind of time period is he talking about? Well, if we go on, we'll see. Right, after the matzah maror or the matzah and maror, as you prefer, right? Right? The bracha on eating a korban, right? Now, this is not in my Haggadah. I don't know if it's in your Haggadah, right? But it's in the Rambam, because so here, right, at this point, he's talking about the time when there is a sacrifice to eat, right? There's the korban chagiga, and then in the next line, you say the bracha on the korban pesach, and you eat that, right? So we're clearly talking about, so far, about the time when the Beis Hamikdash is standing. Now, the time when the Beis Hamikdash is standing, matzah is deraisa, because it's always deraisa, and maror is also deraisa. So we don't have that issue of eating them combined in the same way. And Hillel, right? Hillel will agree that today we need to separate them because we might have this issue of the tastes interfering. But at the time of the Beis Hamikdash, he certainly thought you could wrap them all up, right? Because they're both deraitas. And so that's what the Rambam is saying, that if this is the time of the Beis Hamikdash, the time when you're having your korbanos at the Seder also, then you can choose, basically. You can follow Hillel or you can follow the rabbis. You can have your matzah and maror all together, or in a sandwich and make one bracha for them even, or you could have them both separately. Now, a little bit. However, Zman hazeh, right? She'ein sham korban. In these times, when there is no korban here, right? We don't have the korbanos. Then Harsh mevarech hamotzi lechem, chozer mevarech al achilat matzah, v'tabel matzah b'charoset v'ochel. Right, now that there's no korban, so first you say a bracha of hamotzi, and you say a bracha of al achilat matzah, and he says you dip the matzah in charoset, which is interesting. I don't think that that's something most of us do these days. It seems to have been the Rambam's opinion, and you eat it, and then you say the bracha on maror, right? So except for the dipping matzah and charoset, this is now much more familiar to us, right? No more choices. But we do everything, right? So we don't choose A or B, we do both A and B, right? We say the bracha on the matzah, we say the bracha on the maror, and then chozer v'korech matzah and maror, and we eat them, obviously, and then we wrap them together, imitabel b'charoset, again, dip in the charoset, v'ochlan below bracha, zecher l'mikdash. And we eat them without a bracha, zecher l'mikdash, in memory and commemoration of the Beis Hamikdash. Any questions? Does this sound now, right? Now that we got to Zman hazeh, does this sound now like Rambam is describing what we do in our Haggadah? chat box is very quiet today. I wonder if everyone knows how to use it. It's fine. I can just talk as long as I don't run out of hot water and honey. We're going to follow the chain of halachic development because there is something missing from the Rambam that we, might, if we're really paying attention and comparing it to the Haggadah that, I think most of us, at least Ashkenazim again, use today, I think we're missing something in the Rambam. So let's move on. The next source on here is the Torah. Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher wrote a halachic code that draws heavily on the Rambam. And I'm going to skip here, and he's going to where he writes and another tidbit that we have not seen yet, which is that, first of all, he takes issue with the Rambam about charoset on the matzah, right? That's one thing, and he talks about, how to relate to the charoset in general, right? Do we dip it and shake it off? And do we, does the charoset get its own bracha? No, because it's part of the mar, right? This whole discussion about that. And then he cites, it's not entirely clear if he's citing the Rosh, his father or his brother here, but he's citing one of them. And it says that somebody who wants to keep the mitzvah min hamufar, like the choicest way of doing the mitzvah, should not interrupt until he does this kricha like Hillel, until he has Hillel sandwich. Kadesh ta'alelo birkat matzah amar v'kricha kehillel, so that his bracha on matzah and his bracha on maror will count for the wrap, right? Because if you interrupt, then you might have an issue as far, with if you haven't completely fulfilled perhaps matzah and the mitzvahs of matzah and maror, right? We're doing it two ways to fulfill two different viewpoints on what the mitzvah is. So if we're going to do it these two ways and say that, well, maybe we should be doing it like Hillel, maybe we should be doing it like Rabbanan, then we probably want both to be covered by the bracha without any interruption, right? So he says, best thing is to not interrupt between until after you've eaten your Korech sandwich. Again, because since the halacha wasn't determined to either one, we try to be strict for both opinions. And he says, you got to be careful about sicha chulin, about any sort of just conversation, right, about mundane things. But there are some things where, Gemara's elsewhere talk about, if you want to say, oh, here, take this piece of matzah, right, you can do that. That's not an interruption. Or here, where's the salt, right, is a common example that's used, right? There are certain things that you can say because they're part of what you're doing, right? Okay. Now, still the chat box is quiet, and nobody's asked me and nobody has raised what's missing in the Rambam. It's not, the Torah didn't say it, but the Torah sort of enhances the question a little bit. But we're going to go to the next step in halachic development. It's the Shulchan Aruch by Rabbi Yosef Karo, modeled on the Torah, but always with some, slight tweaks here and there, and differences, things added, other opinions, other practices, structured a little differently sometimes, in minor ways. But so we're going to look there and see what the Shulchan Aruch says, and you're going to say, oh, of course, yes, that's what was missing from Rambam. But then we're going to have a question about the Torah. And we have 10 minutes, so that's lovely. Maybe some of you will have a few minutes to stay with me longer. Since we started late. So the Shulchan Aruch, again, very, very much like the Torah, talks about Netilas Yadayim, and you say the bracha on the matzah, and you eat it, and you say the bracha on the maror, and you eat it, and you deal with the charoset, however your family, minhag says to deal with the charoset. And then you take the third matzah, and you break it, and you korcha im hamar b'tovel b'charoset. You wrap it with the mar, and you dip it in charoset, right? And again, some will say to shake it off, right? And now what's this line? V'omer zecher l'mikdash kehillel. Now, you might have thought we saw this already, because we saw the words zecher l'mikdash kehillel, but we didn't see the word v'omer, right? We didn't see it to say that we're supposed to say anything. We only saw to do it. In fact, the Rambam specified what we don't say, right? The Rambam specified v'ochlan below bracha, zecher l'mikdash. The Rambam pointed out, made sure we know there's no bracha to say on Korech. And you eat them. He didn't say anything about what we do say on Korech. Shulchan Aruch now is telling us that there's this thing to say that we're eating at Zecher L'Mikdash Kehillel, not just to do this Zecher L'Mikdash Kehillel, right? Not just to do it as a commemoration of the Beis Hamikdash like Hillel did, but to actually say that's what we're doing, to actually sit there and declare, like Mr. said, I want to do this just like Hillel, right? I like Hillel's style, right? I want to be like, this is peer pressure a little bit, right? Not peer pressure. We're not peers, right? But but we were to actually declare we were doing this like Hillel as a Zecher Mikdash. So now that's the new edition. And I said, we're also going to have a question. We're going to have the question from the Torah, but also from the Shulchan Aruch itself. Because what did the Torah say about saying stuff? Right? The Torah said, is a mitzvah min hamubchar, right? It's the choicest way to do things is to not interrupt. Don't talk until you eat your korech, right? Until you eat your sandwich. And Shulchan Aruch just told us to talk, right? Before you eat it, to say Zecher Mikdash Kilo, right? Say this, right? Omer Zecher Mikdash Kilo, v'ochlam biachad b'haseba, and eat them together while reclining. And then the Shulchan Aruch goes on and echoes that line in the Torah about interruption, right? And says even stronger. Misha berech al achilat matzah lo yasiach b'davar she'eno mi'inyan hasuda ad she'yochal korech hazot. Don't interrupt with anything that's not about the meal until you eat the sandwich, right? He doesn't even say it's a mitzvah min mufchar, like the choicest way to do things. He just says don't eat, right? Sorry, don't talk until you eat. Because you want the bracha on the matzah and you want the bracha on the maror to count for the korech, just in case korech is really the way to, is really the best way, is really the way that we're supposed to be fulfilling it. So what do we do about this, right? Is there a problem with the saying, right? And this is where I thought, right? We talked about what we do, right? The doing and the why, sort of, and different perspectives on the why. And now we're talking about what we say, and maybe we should question what we say, right? Again, we're used to it. We always do it. But is it an interruption? Should we really be saying this? What do we do with this Shulchan Aruch? Oh, there it goes. So one way, I'm going to anticipate a little bit what we're going to see, because the Shulchan Aruch does qualify what he says here, right? Don't interrupt with anything that is not mi'inyan hasuda, with anything that's not of the matter of the feast, if I can be really literal about it, right? Anything that's not, so what does that mean though? Anything that's not connected to the meal, right? What counts as something that is part of the meal? So as it turns out, the Mishnah Berurah, with a few things. First of all, so I put on a few lines from the Mishnah Berurah here, the Chafetz Chaim's commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. These first couple we don't necessarily need to read, but he points entirely. But he points out in terms of the charoset and in terms of the, I think he says about the reclining also, right? In terms of various details of how we have this korech, he points out that why do we do it like that? Because it's Zecher Mikdash Hillel, right? So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, right? We're emulating Hillel, so we're really going to emulate like Hillel. We're really going to do this the way that Hillel did it. We do it first like the Rabbanan did it, right? First like those who disagreed with Hillel would do it, to have matzah and the maror separately. And then when we want to cover our bases and fulfill the mitzvah fulfill these mitzvahs the way Hillel would do it, we do it really like him. So the way that he would do it in the time of the Beis Hamikdash would have been to dip it in charoset. So we also dip it in charoset, right? And he would have, and in terms of the brachos, also he says that that's the concern with the brachos, right? We want the brachos to cover, right, the korech sandwich, because that's how Hillel would do it. He would say the brachos on his korech sandwich because that's how he was fulfilling the mitzvah. So we really want to make sure to keep things, just the way that Hillel would have in our korech, just the way that Hillel would have done it in his day. We turn the page to page 5. I really can't see. When we get to going on in the Mishnah Berurah, so it comments on that word va'omer, right? When the Shulchan Aruch says that there's something we should say, the Mishnah Berurah is like, well, 1 second. He doesn't say much. He just says, "Si bir halacha." Now, the bir halacha is the also by the Mishnah Berurah, but it's more analytical, let's say. Mishnah Berurah kind of tries to give you like the main basic, sort of explanations to keep you going, and a little bit practical, a little bit background, right? Bir halacha gets more analytical usually. So sometimes he'll reference you, back and forth between these two works that he wrote. Before we see the bir halacha, I want to just note here, because the bir halacha is going to object to this saying, right? The bir halacha is going to be very concerned that making this declaration of what we're doing is an interruption, which is interesting. I think it's important to note this because in the next line, the Mishnah Berurah, right? Again, same guy, same Chafetz Chaim writing both. Set comments when the Shulchan Aruch says what we're supposed to say is Zecher Mikdash Hillel, right? It sounds like he really just means those 3 words, right? this is, remembrance of the Beis Hamikdash like Hillel, Chomp, right? The Mishnah Berurah, the Chofetz Chaim comments, Nuscha Tzleinu b'Haggadah, right? The phrasing, right? The wording that we have in our Haggadah, that's in common use, in common practice, is to say a little bit more, right? Not just Zecher Mikdash Hillel, but Kenas Hillel Bisman Shabbos Mikdash Chule, right? He says we say a little more. Haya Korech Matzah Amar, we describe what he did. And he notes that some say that you should say Pesach Matzah Amar, not just Matzah Amar, right? Now it's interesting to me that as much as the Chofetz Chaim in his Biur Halacha, source number 7, that we're going to see in a second, objects to making this declaration, in the Mishnah Berurah, he also gives his, nusach of what he thinks the common practice in his, milieu is for how to say it, right? So it doesn't sound to me like in practice he's objecting too strongly, right? It sounds to me in practice like he's saying, yes, say this declaration and this is what you should say, right? But we still want to understand what's going on a little bit. So you see what he says in Biur Halacha, and he basically, I'll skip to the end, right? Spoiler alert. He says he closes with tzarachiyut, that it needs study, right? So he's not really satisfied about it. Again, in the Mishnah Berurah, he seems to be telling us say the thing, right? And this is the thing that you should say. In the Biur Halacha, he's uncomfortable about it and leaves it kind of unresolved. Why is he uncomfortable? As he says, it's kasha, right? It's difficult. Isn't this saying, right? Hello amirazu, isn't this declaration hefsek between the bracha and the sandwich, right? And he says what we just pointed out, the Mechaber himself, right? The Shulchan Aruch, the author of the Shulchan Aruch himself, ended by saying, don't make an interruption, right? Because you want the bracha to count for the sandwich also. And he says, and this is where we get into some subjectivity, right? He says, v'dochach lomar, it's like far-fetched to say, it's a reach to say that this declaration is, to use those words that the Shulchan Aruch used, me inyan hasuda. Right? He says it's a stretch to say that this declaration is me inyan hasuda, is of the feast, like saying, here, take this and say bracha, right? Like these other examples that are used in halacha that come up that are not considered interruptions. He goes on, he says, I've never found anyone else who says that we should say this, right? Which again is not completely the case, right? He says he's never seen a posek, but clearly he has a Haggadah that says to say, over this declaration, right? So he says, I haven't really seen poskim who say this like the Mechaber does, right? They just write that the sandwich is a commemoration of the Beis Hamikdash, but not that we should say it's a commemoration of the Beis Hamikdash, right? Which again is a key difference, right? The Gemara said it's a commemoration of the Mikdash, but didn't say to say anything about that, right? Just do it. And he gives a couple of possibilities. Right? He says, "Ulai lav dafka katav hamachaber." Maybe the Mechaber wasn't being very specific in the way that he wrote this. So maybe what he meant was you should start eating your sandwich. Right? He says start eating, but maybe eat the whole thing, and then say the declaration, and then it won't be hefsek, right? Maybe that's what he meant. And I think it's a stretch to say that that's what the Shulchan Aruch meant. Take a quick look at the Aruch HaShulchan, not to be confused with the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Hillel Michal Epstein, who lived couple of hundred years later. And he says, in his, restating and reformulation of the halacha, he says, "V'korchan yachad v'ochlan b'haseba v'omrim zecher l'mikdash kehilel." So what's the difference, right? The Shulchan Aruch says, wrap it up, say the thing, and eat the thing, the other thing. The Aruch HaShulchan seems to say, wrap it up, eat it while reclining, and then say the thing, right? So it could be, and the Aruch HaShulchan doesn't get into it explicitly, but it could very well be that he did what the Biur Halacha is suggesting here out of the same concern, right? It's going to be hefsek to say it, so eat first, so the bracha covers your eating, and then say the declaration. So that could be one approach he suggests. And he says, and really, if I weren't in doubt, right, like I would, I'm not quite sure, but I might have said that there's like a scribal error, basically, right, that there's a scribal error here, and that really he meant to say, Divin the Choset Zecher Mikdash, not say this, right, and take out the word say. Others are very strongly opposed to that. What do you mean? It's in everything, right? It's in all the Haggadahs, and it's in the Shulchan Aruch, right? And so one of those is Rabbi Vadia Yosef. I see that I'm past 2:00. I won't be offended if people who were banking on 1 to 2 or whatever time it is in your time zone need to step out. But I'm going to try to go a few more minutes to get the full full hour for those with the recording, or who have a few more minutes now. So Rabbi Yosef raises this issue, right? He starts off, sort of outlining the earlier sources that we saw, and he quotes the Shulchan Aruch, on page 7 now, and then he says, and the esteemed author of the Mishnah Berurah in the Bir Halacha, right? Again, same guy, both written by the Chafetz Chaim, wrote about this, right? And we just saw what he wrote about it, so I didn't, put it in again. So he's going to address that concern now, right? Is this declaration a hefsek? Is it an interruption or is it not? He says, first of all, I want to, preface by saying that we sure do find poskim who've said just like the Shulchan Aruch, right? He says, it's like, I don't really know what's going on with the Bir Halacha, where was he looking? And it happens to be, right? And I'm putting that in Rabbi Vadia's words, clearly. I know, whatever it is that the Bir Halacha looked at or didn't look at, it happens to be that Rabbi Vadia Yosef is known for this like encyclopedic knowledge and copying and quoting of different sources, right? So he has at his fingertips all sorts of poskim, all sorts of sources, all sorts of responsive literature, and commentaries on different halachic works and all that. So he definitely, if anyone's going to find it, he would find it, I suppose. And he says of course we find other sources besides the Shulchan Aruch who say to make this declaration. And he gives he gives a bunch of examples. And he says, and God forbid to like go and amend the text of all of these rabbis, right? Of all of these scholars, because they all say that you should say the declaration. It says so like that, little hesitant suggestion at the end of the Bir Halacha. Maybe we need to amend the text. Maybe he didn't really need to say it. The Rabbi says, but they all say it, right? Lots of people say it, and we're not going to go in and start making emendations in everybody. Okay, so that's the first point that he wants to make. And then he says the reason. So why aren't we concerned about a hefsek, right? Or why are we not concerned that this declaration is going to interrupt between the bracha and the eating and fulfilling the mitzvah the way that Hillel did? It says he says a couple of things. He says, first of all, that if he says even according to Hillel, right? He's quoting he's working off of Tosfot's explanation here, which we didn't see, but we'll go with it. He says even according to Hillel, who thinks that you need to wrap the matzah and maror together and eat them together. Zehu rak lechachila. He says even for Hillel, it's only lechachila. It's only the ideal way to fulfill the mitzvah. But after the fact, as long as you've eaten both of them, even if you ate them one after the other instead of together, you've fulfilled your obligation, even according to Hillel, right? So Hillel says you need to, but it's like a sort of gray, fuzzy need, right? You could, if you ate them separately, then you have fulfilled your obligation, which means that we're not really trying to fulfill the mitzvah twice by doing it, the separate way and the together way. We are fulfilling it once by eating matzah and maror separately, because even Hillel will acknowledge that fulfills the obligation, right? He's not ideal, but it fulfills the obligation. So we've already fulfilled it according to all opinions. Then why are we doing this thing where the Gemara says we do both ways? That's the only reason that we then wrap it up and eat them again together after we've eaten them apart is to fulfill the Zecher Mikdash. It is purely a commemoration of the Beis Hamikdash, not an attempt to fulfill the mitzvah again, right? Which means that it's not such a big deal if you have an interruption, right? He says, and we can go in two directions with this, right? Number one, we're not fulfilling the mitzvah with this korech. We're remembering the old way of fulfilling the mitzvah, which means that we don't have to worry about interrupting between the bracha and the fulfillment, right? We've already fulfilled it. And the other piece of that is that since inherently, right, the real essence of what we're doing here is Zecher LeMikdash, that means that saying it's Zecher LeMikdash is absolutely min ha'inyan, right? It is absolutely, right? Remember the Bir Halacha said, yeah, it's a little bit of a stretch to say that, making this declaration about what we're doing counts as being an inherent part of the meal, right? Rather than an interruption. And Rabbi Vadia says, of course, it's inherent part of the meal because of what we're doing, right? Because that's exactly what we're doing. We are doing something not to fulfill the obligation. Technically, we did that already, right? Even according to Hillel, really, we did it already, b'diavad, right? What we're doing right now is an act that is zecher lemikdash. And since what we're doing right now is zecher lemikdash, you can't say that saying it's zecher lemikdash is an interruption, right? It's inherently bound up with it. It's an inherent part of what we're doing rather than an interruption. So you have kind of two layers then in Rav Avadia to say that it's not a problematic interruption. All right, so far so good. Still the chat box is empty, but still there, you're with me. I see people still here, so hopefully we're all together, in the ideas and the concepts, not just physically or separately. Okay. I want to go on. I put on here just an excerpt from with Chaim Jafter to kind of solidify, or offer a framework for the Bir Halacha and Rav Avadia. Though I think that he might explain it a little bit differently than I just did. But what he says also I think is important, useful framing as well that we could think about, where he says that possibly the difference between the Bir Halacha and Rav Avadia is that the Bir Halacha says if you want to have an interruption between the bracha and the act, it has to be one that's necessary for the mitzvah, whereas Rav Avadia says that relevance is enough. Now again, I'm not sure that I see that distinction as clearly in the words of what they each write, but it's certainly a good framing to think about. Also, Rejector actually has a whole bunch of articles, either about Korech or that relate to Korech tangentially, including an article about divorce documents, about a very technical aspect of carrying out divorces in halacha, where he ends up talking about Korech in that context and in some other contexts. So it's fun to go through. He's good material out there. Going to skip it most of it, however. And maybe that. Let's see. All right, I want to talk a little bit more about this Zecher Mikdash issue to finish off our learning together. And I will post. I didn't get to post the handout on the WebYeshiva site before class, but I will God willing do it after we finish. So you can always go back there and download it and have it for yourself and look at things more. This idea of Zecher Mikdash. So again, in my excursions through the internet on this topic, I came across a Svaria sheet put together by Sarah Wolkenfeld, who's the chief learning officer at Svaria. I had the privilege to work with her for a bit, and I liked this sort of note that she made in the course of presenting her sources and putting in getting some thought questions or thought pieces on this sheet that she made on Svaria, and she notes that Korech is missing its central component, and I added in brackets that that's according to some, right? Because there's a bit of disagreement whether Hillel's sandwich included the Korban Pesach, and that's the central component that we're missing now, or it didn't even include the Korban Pesach. He had the Korban Pesach on one side of his plate and his sandwich, matzah and maror, separately. But either way, it's certainly missing something, right? It's missing the element of being eaten alongside the Korban Pesach or with the Korban Pesach in it. So it's certainly missing a lot. The experience was designed around the Passover sacrifice, which is no longer a part of our Seder night routine. And I like this. So she says, you could imagine a world in which this ritual might have been cast aside in the wake of destruction and change, but instead it was reinvented. And I think that's, a good, a useful framing to think about what it is that we're doing here, right? We can throw around the term Zecher Mikdash. Again, it was an article that I saw, sort of going through the Gemara that we looked at, that pointed out that this idea of doing something Zecher Mikdash is an unusual phrase, and the author commented and acknowledged that doesn't sound unusual because we're used to it because we say this every year. But if we weren't used to it from the Haggadah, right, it would be unusual, right? This whole idea that there was a practice that was inherently tied up with the Korban Pesach that we can't do anymore. But instead of dropping it by the wayside, for some reason we've kept it going. Right? She doesn't say for some reason, but I'm saying for some reason, right? We've kept it going. We've reinvented it. Now it's not part of eating the Korban Pesach and how we do that, but it's this new thing called Zecher LeMikdash, the commemoration, right? Remembrance of the Mikdash. And what is it that we're really doing when we are remembering something from the Mikdash? So what I have here, the rest of the handout here, different sort of aspects that I wanted to look at, which again we're not going to really have time for. But one of them is this Gemara in Menachos about something else that we do as a Zecher Mikdash in the Gemara, which is the way that we count the Omer. And that well, we don't do it actually. This is the opinion we don't follow. There was an opinion that because we no longer have the Korban Omer, that the counting we do is only Zecher Mikdash, and therefore only count the days but not the weeks. As a question, why would a Mimar do it this way, right? Again, we don't follow this, right? Where the accepted halacha practice is to count the days and the weeks when we count the Omer, to say both. But a Mimar had this idea, and we want to still understand his idea, right? His idea was that since these days it's only a commemoration, right? We don't have there's no Korban Omer that we're counting according to, right? We're only doing it Zecher LeMikdash, so we should count differently. Why does that mean we should count differently? So there are a couple of explanations that I shared on here. One of them is that we want to differentiate this from Rabbi Jechter. It's possible that we want to make a clear distinction between something that is a rabbinic obligation and a Torah obligation, or possibly just a minhag versus a rabbinic obligation or a Torah obligation. And he brings a whole bunch of sort of halachic sources that talk about different aspects of different halachos where we see that this might be an issue at play. We want to make a clear distinction, so we shouldn't mix anything up, right? We want to make sure that our non-Torah obligation practices are not getting mixed into any kind of violation of Baal Tosef, right? We're not supposed to add to the Torah's mitzvos. We do other things, but we want to make it very clear that they're different, right? That they're not Torah obligations, that they're rabbinic, or that they're minhag. So it's possible that a Meimar was suggesting that we should count differently than how it was done in the Beis Hamikdash in order to make that distinction, in order to make a clear distinction. What we're doing now is not what we did then, right? Then it was a Torah obligation. Now it's rabbinic or it's minhag, depending how we understand it. But it's no longer a Torah obligation, so we have to do something differently to make that clear, right? That's one possibility. And we might say that perhaps, right, the recitation, right? Why do we say this thing that causes the Biur Halacha so much concern, right? We have this declaration, right? Why don't we just eat the sandwich? Why do we have to talk about eating the sandwich, right? And so it could be, Rabbi Jechter suggests, that maybe we're doing that. Maybe we announce it in order to make that distinction, right? And maybe that's what makes it an integral component, so that it's not an interruption between the brachot. So that's one thing that I wanted to share. One possible explanation of that, and sort of think about when we're eating Korech, right? We're having this commemoration, but that's not the same thing as having the Beis Hamikdash, and as doing, as being able to eat the sandwich the way that Hillel ate the sandwich. Going back to page 9 for a second, Rav Soloveitchik famously talks about different types of remembering Beis Hamikdash. One of them is to remember the glory days of the Beis Hamikdash, where we do things emulating how it was done in the Beis Hamikdash. And the other way is to remember the destruction. I see I'm losing my audience, so we're gonna, I am gonna wrap it up. Wrap it up. No pun intended. So he places the Korech in the sort of recalling the grandeur, right? Because we're emulating, but there's always going to be, I think, some aspect of we still remember that that's not it, right? It's not it. It's not the deraisa that we're doing. It's not the Beis Hamikdash, with the korban and the pomp and the excitement and the kedusha that we're doing, right? This is still something different. So it could be that that's a necessary part of emulating and imitating what Hillel did, is to say that we're actually not, right? We're not doing what he did. We're only emulating. We're only remembering it. And I'll end with this beautiful idea from the Belzer Rebbe, where he points out, right, and I said we're going to come back to that question of, why is it that we're looking at a Pesach Sheni Pasuk? It's for this whole, for this whole idea, for this whole discussion of how we eat the matzah and the maror, and whether they're supposed to be wrapped up together or eaten separately. So it turns out there's actually another pasuk that could have been quoted, and there are those who have suggested over the years that it's actually a scribal error, and this is the pasuk that was meant to be quoted, but that's less fun. A pasuk talking about Pesach in Mitzrayim, that says, eat the meat of the Korban Pesach, roasted, and matzos on mar, right? Together with mar, you should eat it, right? So again, we have the Korban Pesach, we have a pasuk that is about the Korban Pesach, and the matzah and the mar are being eaten all, either, all at the same table, like Rabbanan, or all in a wrap, or at least two of them in a wrap, like Hillel. So why not quote the pasuk about the real Pesach? Why do we base all of this on the pasuk about Pesach Sheni? So the Belzer Rebbe, apparently, and I saw him quoted a few different places. This is the one that I was able to find in writing, clearly online that I could share here. Raised the question. It was actually the Sar Shalom, and then his son gave the answer. Raised the question of why we use this pasuk, and the answer that his son gave is that the words, l'kayem ma shenemar, to fulfill what is said, right? To fulfill that which is said, al mitzvos merurim, right? To fulfill that which is said in the pasuk about Pesach Sheni, that we should eat it all together. That's the pasuk that the Haggadah brings. That is actually lashon bakasha. That's the language, right? We're not just making a declaration here, like it sounds like. We're actually making a request. We're davening. We're praying for something, right? We're praying. V'kavanasenu yishmeachar ve'ein lanu achshav beis amiras ha'Haggadah beis mikdash ve'ein hakravat korban pesach b'foal. Since we don't have right now at this minute when I'm making this declaration and saying the things, saying and doing all the things in the Haggadah, I don't have a beis mikdash and I don't have korban pesach in actuality, right? But I'm davening that I should, right? And what I'm davening for, right? Shusheinu v'yivneh is beis mikdash ad et hakravat korban pesach sheni. You know what, Hashem? I want to be able to fulfill this, not just sit here and eat it like Hillel did when there was a Beis Hamikdash and loose, empty commemoration, right? That's not even really the same thing, and I can even interrupt because really I'm fulfilling it separately, right? Like I'm not really doing it, right? I'm remembering, but it's different, and I'm saying this thing because it's different, right? To distinguish and to emphasize that it's different, even as I'm emulating it, I'm emphasizing that it's not the same thing. And he says, so we choose it. So he suggests that we use the pasuk about Pesach Sheni to do that in order to, as an allusion to say, Hashem, I would like to be able to do this for real in time for Pesach Sheni, right? Between now, right? It's Pesach. It's regular Pesach right now. A month from now, I want, please, give us the Beis Hamikdash, but by then, in time that I can fulfill on Pesach Sheni. It says that's why we have this wording of l'kayim, to fulfill, because we want to be able to fulfill what is said about Pesach Sheni, al matzos merurim yochluhu, right, and not just to do it on Pesach, in the non-real way, on regular Pesach. So thank you for sticking out with me with the delay and then the overtime. I apologize for that, but I appreciate the opportunity to learn with you, and hope we can do it again sometime. Have a wonderful Chag Kasher B'Sameach, and hopefully the building of the Beis Hamikdash in time for Pesach, or at least Pesach Sheni. Thank you.